Well, hey, Impact Communities, thank you so much for clicking play. Hopefully, you enjoyed last week as we began this new process of doing the Discovery Bible Study method. We'll be continuing on with that, as Pastor Jeff mentioned last week. But I want to go ahead and dive into recapping this past Sunday's message as we went into Rethinking Habits Part 3, and we were looking at developing others. And I love the way that Pastor Josh really launched into that message, just saying that developing others is really all about discipleship, and discipleship is all about developing others. It's that idea of growing and helping somebody grow in their relationship with the Lord. And Pastor Josh gave us really 4 steps to developing others. Or I love the way that he said this. He says it's leaving a legacy, which I think that has been hardwired into all of us, and wanting to leave a legacy, living a life that's going to outlive ourselves. And the reality is that as followers of Jesus, we've all been given a legacy to leave behind, and that is the legacy of Jesus. So the 4 steps that Pastor Josh gave us were this. In case you missed it, it was we have to have a conviction for developing others. And he really talked about how in the book of Numbers, Moses had this conviction that Moses knew that he wasn't going to be the guy that was going to lead the Israelites into the promised land. So he had this conviction, this plead for the Lord that, God, would you raise up somebody else who was going to be a strong leader for these people once my time has come? And God says, you've already been developing that person, and that person is Joshua. However, Pastor Josh also shared with us what can go awry, if you will, when that developing others isn't a conviction. And we see that all through the book of Judges. And it actually, it brought light something to me just listening to Josh talk about that, just knowing God's heart for the next generation. And if we're not developing others, think about this. If we're not discipling other people the way that we have been commissioned to do, to go and make disciples of all people, of all nations, then really what happens is we allow every passing generation to grow closer and closer to be more like the Israelite people in the book of Judges, where you start seeing the common thread through each chapter of being, they began to do what was right in their own eyes. And I think that we could take a look around in the world right now, and we can say, man, it really feels like a lot of people are doing what seems right in their own eyes. And I think a lot of that has to do with that we have lost this conviction within ourselves of wanting to develop and disciple other people. So I would just pray for you and for me that we would develop that conviction within our own lives to develop and disciple others. The second step was this. We have to develop a process for developing others. We talked about this. For us, we have this leadership pipeline, and sometimes that can look very businessy, but again, we believe, especially here at Lakeland, that the process of developing others is something that Jesus already modeled for us. And Pastor Josh talked about what that model looks like. If you haven't had the chance to listen to this past weekend's message, let me encourage you to go do that so you can see what that model looks like. It was fun watching online this past weekend during the first service, and there was a lady who chimed in and she says, this is something that we do. She works in with special need kids, and she says, this is something that we do with special need kids and helping them to develop for themselves. So really cool stories that were kind of sprinkled in on the chat this past weekend. The third step, I see in you moments, right? The great example that Pastor Josh gave was that of Matthew 16, verses 16 through 18, where Jesus does this whole name change with Peter, changing it from Simon to Peter, so a broken reed to a rock. And the I see in you that we get to have the opportunity to do for everybody that God has crossed our paths, we get the opportunity to do I see in yous. Again, harking back to week 1 of the Rethinking Habits, it's the opportunity to be a shepherd and to act out the habit of being a shepherd in somebody else's life in the same way that somebody was probably a shepherd in your life and did an I see in you moment with you. And then the last step was that of prophetic declaration, which was different than the I see in you one, because the I see in you is what we see in each other and we begin to call that out in somebody, but that the prophetic declaration is what God sees in you. And this is something that we believe needs to be developed a little bit more on our end here at Lakeland, and maybe with many of you. But it's that idea of being so in tune with the Holy Spirit that we can see what God has in mind for somebody else, and maybe just call that out and saying, hey, I see something like this in your future at some point in some capacity, but that's being Holy Spirit led, because that's what God is seeing in somebody else versus just what we see in somebody as well. So as you walk out this week and living out the habit of developing others, I want you to keep in mind that developing others is just simply being a disciple who makes disciples. It's that discipleship process. And it's the process of leaving a legacy that outlives our lives. It's living a legacy that lasts. And it's living the legacy that Jesus left behind for us to leave behind as well, for generations to come. So I hope you guys have a great discussion time as you talk about this past week's message, as you dive into the Discovery Bible Study Method. And I can't wait to see you all next week for Rethinking Habits Part 4. Have a great week. God bless.